Has Donald Trump forced the UK government to do what it has shrunk away from doing for years and years? Yes, defence spending is on the rise, international aid spending is falling to pay for it, and all 2 days before Keir Starmer visits Donald Trump in the White House. My name's Tom Harwood and this is GBN Originals. We're 3 years on since the war in Ukraine, and the UK has always boasted of being one of the strongest partners of that country, one of the largest contributors to NATO. We've spent more than 2% on our armed forces for years, indeed for decades. 2.3% at the last count. That's above the NATO spending requirement of 2%, that almost mandatory recommendation. And yet, Donald Trump, the new president of the United States, has been calling on European countries to spend far more. Many European countries, the majority of members of NATO, have not been meeting that 2% target in recent years. The UK, whilst it always has met that target, there has been enormous pressure to spend more money on our armed forces. Why? Well, we're one of 2 nuclear powers in the European area. What does that mean? Well, we spend quite a bit of that 2.3% of GDP on our at-sea continuous nuclear deterrent. Yes, tens of billions of pounds are spent on Trident. Money well spent, most in the military will say, but it does mean there's less as a sense of that proportion of that percentage for conventional boots on the ground. By some assessment, we're going to be seeing our armed forces reduced to around 70,000 people in the next couple of years. That's our standing army. Not a strong position, indeed the smallest standing army since before the times of Napoleon for this country. That clearly is not a sustainable place to be in. But if we want to be a nuclear power, which clearly the majority of Brits still do, if we want to keep our seat at the top table in the world as one of those P5, permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, indeed one of those most important powers, global powers, when it comes to our armed forces, well, it needs money to spend, because it's not just the fact that we have been squeezing our armed forces with spending on our nuclear deterrent, necessary as that might be. We've also done some accounting trickery. Yes, the pension spend on former soldiers is also included in the amount that we spend on our armed forces. Not all armed forces around the world choose to include that little accounting trick in how they calculate their spend. So by some measures, we are perhaps overcounting our regular military capability because we spend so much money on things that actually don't particularly affect the equipment or indeed the troops that we can send on the ground in action around the world.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private Internet Access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
And this is where we get to the new pledge by the Prime Minister. He stood up in the House of Commons today and said that indeed we will be raising that defence spending to 2.5%. But those with stretched out ears, those with memories longer than goldfish, might well remember a similar promise being made by previous Prime Ministers. If we think back to Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, at a summit in Madrid, he announced the UK would raise its defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP. Of course, Boris Johnson then left office as Prime Minister, and so too, while he was out the door, well, that pledge seemed to go out the door too, back down to the 2% minimum, and just a vague ambition to rise to 2.5%. Then Rishi Sunak was the next Prime Minister to promise to get up to 2.5% of expenditure of GDP on defence. That was in the Conservative manifesto. They made much hay out of saying that the Labour Party did not match that promise. And yet, of course, that was a manifesto commitment. The Conservative Party lost that election and the 2.5% was never reached. There was huge criticism over Rishi Sunak's pledge because there were rather vague commitments in terms of how to fund it. As with much in the Conservative manifesto, the funding was based upon future cuts to welfare, cuts to general departments as well. Would that have been achievable? Would the economy have grown a commensurate amount to afford so much of these spending constraints on various government departments? Big questions remain over that. But now we have the third Prime Minister in almost as many years saying again defence spending will rise to 2.5% of GDP. But now, a slight difference in how this will be funded. Yes, Keir Starmer said that this will be funded by cutting foreign aid, down from 0.6 to 0.4% of GDP. That is a pretty hefty cut, and indeed it frees up, well, billions of pounds more to be spent on our armed forces. Questions just on how many billions of pounds more. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said this could free up £6 billion a year, although Keir Starmer said it would free up £13.4 billion a year. Very interesting differences there in the calculations. Did Keir Starmer misspeak in Parliament, as some think, or does he have rosy expectations about the amount of growth that there'll be in our economy up until 2027, which is when that pledge to spend more kicks in? Well, there's much to be discussed here, but one thing that we haven't touched so much upon yet is why now? Why? Well, of course, the Ukraine war matters. We've been spending £3 billion a year on aid to Ukraine over the course of the last 3 years. And of course, Europe will have to pull more weight now that Donald Trump has said that the United States of America will be withdrawing much of its funding to Ukraine for its defence. Indeed, in one vote in the United Nations this week, the United States voted alongside Russia. Is the United States now as a reliable partner for European countries? Or is there some four-dimensional chess being played here? Is Donald Trump simply trying to force European countries to spend more, even more than the minimum that NATO sets out? Well, it seems that he's achieving that. In Germany, there may well be a lift to the debt limit that country has. That famously prudent country may well expand its debt in order to pay more on defence. Keir Starmer, however, has chosen not to engorge the United Kingdom debt. He also has chosen not to raise taxes. No, he's chosen to cut foreign aid. It's a policy that actually was set out in the Reform Party manifesto in the 2024 election. And could this also be part of the puzzle? Not just the fact that that Donald Trump is forcing European leaders to spend more on defence, but also that Nigel Farage and his Reform Party have been ahead in the polls. Indeed, across 7 different pollsters, the Reform Party has taken first place, at least joint first place, or actual first place. Now, this clearly is worrying the Prime Minister. Could this be why he thinks that extra defence spending funded by the, some would call it, populist move of cutting foreign aid spending is so necessary? This policy, as I say, ripped straight from the Reform Party manifesto. Is this how Sir Keir Starmer is turning his eyes on Nigel Farage, moving his crosshairs to that insurgent party leader? We heard on Sunday this week Keir Starmer tell a conference gathered in Scotland of Scottish Labour that Reform and their ilk are dangerous. Clearly, the Reform Party is at the forefront of Keir Starmer's mind, and this perhaps is where this move is quite so clever for the Prime Minister. The vast majority of Brits feel that Ukraine should be more supported. Of course, Donald Trump doesn't necessarily agree. He says some pretty fruity things about President Zelensky and indeed the culpability of that war in Ukraine. Things that the average Brit heartily disagrees with. Does Keir Starmer see a pressure point here to be applied to Nigel Farage, to the Reform Party, which of course is close to President Trump? Does Keir Starmer think that this finally is the wedge issue to press to try and press his own advantage? Nigel Farage, of course, would completely refute that, saying that it's been the Reform Party policy to spend more on defence this whole time. And indeed, Nigel Farage told me on GB News just last week that he disagrees with President Trump over those specific instances, those words of President Zelensky being a dictator. Well, the politics behind this is fascinating, and how it will play out in electoral events is still yet to be seen. We don't have elections in this country until May, when the locals come around, and it might all be forgotten by then. But clearly, there is a play for Reform voters. There is a play for the more socially conservative voters of this country. This is what Number 10 is clearly setting its sights on. Well, we put some of these questions to one of the main men in Keir Starmer's cabinet today. Pat McFadden is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He's in charge of sort of overseeing most government departments at the Cabinet Office. Previous Chancellors of the Duchy of Lancaster have described them as almost the chief operating officer of government. Well, we asked Pat McFadden why on earth this move was happening now. Pat, this is a bold move from the Prime Minister. Firstly, how does this cut to foreign aid align with what the Prime Minister said when he was leader of the opposition? Back in 2021, he admonished Boris Johnson for precisely the same move.
Look, it's not a decision that we took lightly. We appreciate the importance of foreign aid, the soft power, as people say, of these programmes around the world, as well as the humanitarian instinct behind them. But the truth is, we have a very difficult defence context now in Europe, and it's changed a lot in recent years, and it's changed a lot in the last month. And it's important that the government fulfils its first duty, which is to protect its people, and that it responds to the changed context. This debate around 2.5% of GDP on defence has been around for a long time, as you and your viewers will know, and we decided in the context of quite a changed view of European security that this was the moment where, instead of committing to this in general terms, we had to commit to it in specific terms, with both a timetable and a means of funding it.
Yeah, is the Labour Party here, the Labour government, copying the Reform Party on this one? They wanted to up defence spending and pay for it through cuts to foreign aid.
Well, I would remind you that the Labour Party were the founders, co-founders of NATO. Ernest Bevin, just after the Second World War, along with President Harry Truman, George Marshall. This was in many ways a joint British-American effort where the Labour government at the time played a big role. I would also remind you and your viewers that the last time defence expenditure was at 2.5% of GDP was when Labour were in power. The Tories were in power for 14 years, talked about it, didn't do it. In recent years, this has only happened under Labour governments. Our commitment to defence is not new. It is a big part of our history and our tradition, and something that we're very proud of.
OK, Pat McFadden, you said that you want to stop talking in the generality and move to the specific. So let's move to the specific here. Let's move to the numbers. I want you to listen back to what the Prime Minister told the House of Commons a little bit earlier this afternoon. He said that defence spending would be raised by £13.4 billion each and every year. So if it's going to be each and every year, let's listen back to that to what he said in the Commons.
And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027.
Is it actually every year, Pat McFadden? Because that would be a 25% increase in defence spending. That would take away the entire foreign aid budget, not just 0.2% of it.
It will be that in cash terms, because within that there'll be some increase in defence spending anyway as a result of the growing economy. And when you add a greater proportion of that growing economy, that's when you get to an extra £13 billion. So it will be that. It's a substantial increase, and it's important that we use it well.
OK, wait. Let's just dive into this. So is this including inflation, GDP growth that you expected? Is this also including the security services that are going to be counted now in the defence budget, which we haven't counted, well, in the history of the defence budget, including MI5, MI6, the rest of the GCHQ sort of spy network?
By the end of the period, they will be included, but that takes us to 2.6%. That actually takes you over the 2.5% when you include that intelligence and security work to which you referred. And the reason we're doing that is it's in line with NATO practice. Quite a lot of other countries do it. So at the same time as doing this move, it makes sense to count what is included in the same way as other countries do.
Yeah, our viewers are just a bit confused because £13.4 billion per year, that's the equivalent to practically all of the foreign aid budget, what we spend in a year per year on foreign aid as it stands. So it can't really work mathematically.
It can when you take into account the fact that the economy is going to be growing in size over these years as well.
Well, that's not a given, is it?
Put the two together, that's where you get to that figure. That's the projections from the OBR, and when you put the two together, that's when you get to that figure. OK, so that actually
bakes in some pretty high inflation that the OBR was expecting as well. That, I suppose, makes a great deal of sense. But, Pat McFadden, is this exactly what the Prime Minister wanted to do? Or has the UK been bounced into this ahead of a pretty important meeting with Donald Trump on Thursday?
There's no doubt that the international context has changed with the election of President Trump. There's no point in denying that. But this is not an announcement for 1 week or for one meeting. This is an announcement for Britain's security interests for many, many years to come. And the reason we're doing it is partly because of what we've seen in Europe over the last few years, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As the Prime Minister said, the idea of Russian tanks once again rolling through European cities in a way that at the end of the Cold War we thought we wouldn't see again. But we have seen in recent years. But also the election of President Trump has put a new context into this, in the sense that the assumptions that people have made about being able to rely on an American security umbrella can't be seen in the same way as they were before. He's been very clear about that, and the government has a duty to respond to the international situation in which we find ourselves. Modern warfare has changed, the demands on defence have changed, and the geopolitics have changed, and our duty in those circumstances is to protect the British people, and that's what this announcement today will do.
OK, now Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, will be meeting with Donald Trump, as you say, and he'll be able to tell him that we're boosting defence spending, as Donald Trump has demanded many, many a time, on many an occasion. What will Keir Starmer ask from Donald Trump?
Well, it's an important meeting. I'm sure they'll cover lots of areas. I think when it comes to Ukraine, he will be saying we don't just want fighting to stop. We want a lasting and enduring peace with security guarantees for Ukraine so that this just doesn't start up again in a year or two or whenever the Russians decide to regroup. And I think they'll have a lot of really important discussions about that issue, about security, about other issues too. This is an important meeting and the Prime Minister is taking it very seriously, as he should, and he's looking forward to meeting the new President, not for the first time, but for the first time since he became President.
Of course, the Prime Minister said in his statement that he refused to make the choice between Europe and the United States, that he wants to act as this bridge. Does that rule out the perhaps hopes of many in your party that there would be a Love Actually moment in the White House on Thursday, where the Prime Minister took a stronger stand against the President of the United States and some of the fruitier things that he's said about President Zelensky being a dictator, about Ukraine being responsible for their own invasion? Might we hear the Prime Minister stand up for decency and democracy a bit more than he has so far when he visits the President?
This thing about not choosing is really important because it's not in the national interest to choose. We have a massively important relationship with European countries in trade, in geography and in security. And that's a big part of today's announcement. So we won't be forced into a choice. We value our friendship with the United States. We value our defence and security cooperation with the United States. But we also value our relationships with Europe. And it's in the British interest not to be forced into that choice, and that's why he said that in the Commons today.
But Pat, you didn't answer the question. Why aren't we going to hear perhaps a stronger tone from the Prime Minister? Might we see yet again the accusation that this is a more poodling relationship? Of course, we saw the French President yesterday in the White House contradict Donald Trump, say things about French spending on Ukraine, French aid to Ukraine that wasn't reciprocal in the way that Donald Trump suggested it was. It seems that in some ways Emmanuel Macron has seemed a stronger figure than our own Prime Minister in the last couple of weeks.
Well, the Prime Minister will always stick up for British interests. The Prime Minister will always tell the truth, and none of us know exactly what we'll see in this meeting on Thursday. What we do know is the British Prime Minister is taking it very seriously, as he should, and that whatever he says and does in the United States will be in the British national interest. That's what people should expect from the British Prime Minister, and that's what they'll get.
OK, Pat McFadden, thank you very much indeed, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster there.
Thank you.
Well, those were the words of the right-hand man to Sir Keir Starmer. What did you make of what he had to say? And are you convinced that the Labour Party has had a Damascene conversion on the issue of foreign aid? Of course, it wasn't so long ago that Keir Starmer was hitting out at Boris Johnson for his proposals to cut foreign aid. Well, they say a week is a long time in politics, and clearly 3 years is even longer. Might this have electoral dividends for Labour? We'll have to wait and see. We'll be following all of the fallout here at the GBN YouTube channel, so remember to subscribe to keep up to date with all the twists and turns in this fascinating story.